Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, more of the Book 4, The Wolfman Chronicles. This is Chapter 7, The Grizzly and the Wolf. We're in Alaska, we're in Mexico. The native legend of the grizzly and the wolf. Now, in the wilds of Alaska, long before the white people came with their lust for gold, there lived two mighty creatures who ruled their respective domains. You had the grizzly, the powerful bear, and the wolf, the cunning hunter. Although they shared the vast wilderness, they were bitter enemies, each believing the other to be a threat to their survival. It had been a particularly harsh winter, and the grizzly awoke hungry. His powerful frame, once his greatest strength, now worked against him as he traversed the still deep snow in search of prey. Meanwhile, Wolf, swift and light, could move through the snow with ease, but found it increasingly difficult to take down the large game needed to feed his pack. On one fateful day, their paths crossed in a dense forest. Both were drawn by the scent of a fallen moose, a potential meal that could mean the difference between life and death. Now they both arrived at the clearing at the same time, and a fierce standoff ensued, their growls and their snarls echoing through the trees. But then, a voice, like the whisper of the wind, spoke to them. It was the great spirit of the wilderness who watched over all creatures and maintained the balance of nature. Grizzly, wolf, listen. The great spirit said, "Why do you fight when the land is vast and the needs of your kin are great? Alone you struggle, but together you can thrive." Grizzly, with his hunger gnawing at him, looked at the lean and agile wolf and saw the truth in the great spirit's words. Wolf, too, realized that the strength of the grizzly could bring down the largest of prey, providing food for both of their families. So they approached the fallen moose, and instead of fighting, they shared the meal. Grizzly used his powerful claws to tear through the tough hide, making it easier for Wolf to access the tender meat. Wolf, in return, used his keen senses to alert them to approaching danger, ensuring that they would eat in peace. And from that day forward, Grizzly and Wolf forged an unspoken pact. They learned to hunt together, combining Grizzly's strength and Wolf's agility to ensure their survival. As the seasons changed and generations passed, the descendants of Grizzly and Wolf continued to honor this ancient pact. They understood that in the wilds of Alaska, survival was not just about strength or cunning alone, but it was about the wisdom to work together. And so the legend of the grizzly bear and the wolf was passed down through the ages, a timeless story of how two enemies became allies, teaching us all that cooperation can overcome even the fiercest of rivalries. Well, Jack and Sasha camped by the banks of the Yukon River. Jack was grateful that Sasha enjoyed camping as much as he did, setting up the tent, boiling hot coffee over a campfire, cuddling in a sleeping bag, and waking at sunrise to the sound of birds singing and crickets chirping. His Circle, Alaska, was just about as remote a town as Jack had ever been in. Now he wondered if Sasha would be satisfied living in a place that was so far from the excitement of the big city, considering she'd previously lived in Moscow. Now that's a bustling megacity of over 13 million people. In fact, it's the largest city in Russia, or even all of Europe. On the other hand, Circle claimed to have a population of just 45. But now that number may have been exaggerated, according to some full-time residents. During the summer months, particularly around the summer solstice, Circle experiences the midnight sun, and it seems as though there is a continuous daylight. The sun actually remains visible 24 hours a day. So nights have a soft glow and there is no real sunrise. But summer temperatures remain crisp and cool. It's almost a balmy 72 degrees for the high, which actually is very much the same as Moscow. Now, wildlife is abundant in and around Circle, and you may be more likely to see a moose or a caribou rather than another person for days at a time. Winters, on the other hand, are rough with the extreme cold temperatures and deep snow, not to mention the extended periods of darkness. Near the winter solstice, Circle may only see a few hours of twilight-like daylight, but the rest of the day is enveloped in total darkness. The sun barely rises above the horizon. Temperatures plummet well below zero and sometimes reach negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, accompanied by biting winds, which only makes the chill factor increase tremendously. Now, snow accumulates several feet deep, and the Yukon River, as well as most other bodies of water, are frozen, covered with thick ice. The northern lights may dance across the sky during the winter, but would that be enough to keep them from going stark or even mad during the winter months? Sasha argued that Moscow is actually very similar with its bitter cold temperatures and deep snow. Lake Baikal, as well as other bodies of water, also freeze in the winter. She argued that except for the population and the fact that she would be enveloped in wilderness rather than city streets and buildings, it would be very similar, and she assured Jack that she'd be more than happy to reside anywhere as long as he was with her. They both knew they needed to find a remote as place as possible if they were going to be safe from Sasha's past and Jack's future. He knew that the part of him that was wolf needed to hunt, and better to have wild game as prey rather than people. He also looked forward to having a safe place for his new niece and nephew, away from a government that would want to test and exploit them. They both knew that if Putin learned of the wolf babies, he would do anything to have them in his laboratory. Jack didn't trust his own government either. It was best just to hide out and keep as low a profile as possible. Yes, there were other locations in Alaska that appealed to Jack, but the Yukon Charlie River Basin was an untouched landscape for the most part. It was up near the Arctic Circle, and it somehow seemed just the right place for so many reasons. Sitting on the bank of the river, they ate their breakfast of bacon and eggs cooked on a camp stove. They talked about what it would be like to live here and how they would make it through the long, cold winters. You know, we're getting a late start on this. We have to find a piece of property that already has a house or a cabin on it that is habitable through the winter. Now, we can begin building right away, but it will be a challenge getting building supplies out here this far. Everything's got to come from Fairbanks. They watched as a pair of bald eagles landed in a tall tree at the water's edge, preparing to catch their next meal. Earlier, a bull moose had stepped out of the thicket on the far bank, grazing the same patch of wild blueberries where Sasha had picked a handful for their own breakfast. It's just so peaceful here, Jack. I can't imagine wanting to live anywhere else. I think you're right that we should find a place with an existing cabin to live in and spend a year here before we really build. I think we're both capable of handling the winters, but we could always go to Miguel's ranch in Mexico if it got to be too much. Well, that's a good point, Jack agreed. Well, after breakfast, they packed up their campsite and they drove back to Grizzly's to see how he was doing. There was no sign of movement as they drove up to the front of the cabin. There was no answer at the door either. Jack hollered out, "Hey, Grizzly," and tried the handle of the front door, which was unlocked. Just then, stumbling around the corner of the house, came old Grizzly himself, dressed only in his long underwear and using his wooden cane for support. "Can't a man go to the outhouse without damn company?" he yelled gruffly, and his face winced in pain as he limped toward the front door. Jack walked over to give him a shoulder to lean on and helped him get back inside. "Well, did you get any sleep last night?" Jack helped old Grizzly to a seat at the kitchen table. Sasha walked over to the cook stove and put on a pot of water to boil to make some coffee. "Oh, maybe a few minutes here and there. It hurt like hell all night, though," Grizzly replied. "Well, let's have a look," Jack said as he sat in a chair opposite Grizz and reached for the old man's leg to unwrap the bandages. He could see that the wound had seeped through the gauze in the dish towels that they'd used as a makeshift covering for the bandages. Jack had removed the old man's pants and when he had first inspected the leg last night and had done the stitching, but it appeared that Grizzly had put on a clean pair of long underwear and had jostled the bandages out of place. "You're still losing blood and the wound is very red and inflamed. I know you don't want to hear this, but we really do need to get you to a doctor. If infection sets in, you are likely to lose this leg completely." And Grizzly looked at Jack and started to say something. And then he stopped. "Oh, hell, you really think it's that bad?" he asked. "I do, and I'm willing to drive you to Fairbanks right now." Jack knew that Grizzly was against that idea, but the pain was so bad he was willing to give in. Grizzly let out a big sigh. "All right then, I suppose you owe me a trip to Fairbanks, but you better not drive off and leave me there. I expect to be right back here in my cabin by tonight." And Jack tried not to grin at the old man's remark and focused on the cup of coffee that Sasha had handed him. Grizzly was grateful to have a cup of hot, fresh coffee. "Oh man, that smells good. Did you bring this? This don't taste like mine." Sasha sat down on the other side of the table. "No, your can's getting low. They're about out. This is some coffee that we brought with us. It's got chicory in it. Man, it makes a nice smooth cup of coffee." Grizzly took another gulp and somehow he seemed just a little bit more relaxed. Like maybe just possibly he was warming up to them just a bit. Sasha took the opportunity to tell him, "If it's okay with you, Grizzly, I'd like to stay here while you two drive into Fairbanks. It's going to be too crowded in the truck with all of us, and I can stay here with the dogs and clean the place up a bit." Grizzly stared at her for a minute. "Next thing you're going to do is ask to move in here." But he didn't say no, and she took that to be a good sign. Jack looked at her gratefully and went on out to get the dogs. "Is it safe to let them out here by the cabin?" Sasha asked. "Are there any wolf traps around I need to be concerned about?" No, there's not any here by the cabin. They're all out by the river where the wolves like to hunt. I don't trap them this close in. That's what my rifle's for, right there by the door." He looked over towards where the rifle hung on a hook. "You know how to use a rifle?" "Yes, Grizzly. I can shoot as well as any man can. You don't need to worry about me." "Hell, I'm not worried about you. They can come eat you for all I care." "Well, if you give me another cup of that good chicory coffee, I might just soften up a bit." Sasha laughed at him and brought him another cup. Jack brought the dogs and Sasha's bag of books in. And the trip to Fairbanks would be about 3 hours, and he knew she'd rather stay here with the dogs and read a book than spend that much time in the truck with that grumpy old man. Jack and Grizzly sat in silence for the first 30 or so miles. Jack tried to strike up a conversation, but Grizzly just sat quietly, stern-faced, looking out the window, kind of lost in his own thoughts. Jack wondered how many years it had been since the old man had left the tiny town of Circle, Alaska. He didn't remember seeing a vehicle around Grizzly's place, and he'd heard the stories how Grizzly had walked into town almost daily with his mule, following along behind him. Most likely the old man hadn't been in a vehicle for quite some time. Finally, after sitting in silence for another dozen or so miles, the old man spoke up. He says, "I was born right here, just a couple of miles over that ridge that you see right there." He pointed at a ridge that was coming up on Jack's left. "See, my old man was a trapper and a hunter and meaner than a polecat when he was drinking. My mom, God rest her soul, was as sweet as the day is long, and she was always trying to protect me from my old man. But I was trapping and hunting right alongside him from the time I could put on my own britches." Jack spurred on the conversation. "So you grew up out here. Yeah, we didn't have no schools. My ma taught me to read and write. My dad taught me how to build and hunt. Not much more than that is necessary around these parts. And then the summer I turned 14, two important things happened in my life. My mom, she died of cancer, and I decided to try my hand at gold panning. It's hard to believe that the two weren't coincidental. The morning that my mom drew her last breath, I just needed to get out of the house. I knew Dad would be drinking away his grief and wanting to take it out on me laters, so I took off. Well, I ain't ashamed to admit I was sitting on a rock by the prettiest little creek I'd ever seen, crying my eyes out, when I thought I saw something gold glinting in the water. Well, I know all about fool's gold, but this was different. It was a good-sized nugget, and it was lying right there at the bottom of the creek bed, lodged in a couple of other bigger rocks. Well, I climbed right in and put my hand on that nugget and pulled, but it was lodged in there tight. I was afraid I'd knock it loose and lose it, so I kept one hand on it while I nudged the other rocks with my foot and my other hand, and eventually I dislodged my rock. Well, it was a gold nugget about the size of the palm of my hand. I carried it home, and I didn't show no one. I especially didn't tell my dad. I hid it under my mattress. So then I kept returning to that same spot, and I found a few more, not quite as large, but nice nuggets anyway. By the end of that summer, I had quite a collection hidden inside my mattress. I told myself when I hit my 15th birthday, I'd take all my treasure into town and collect my earnings. Well, that gold fever really took a hold of me. I kept going out panning and bringing home gold flakes and sometimes more nuggets. And then one day I'd been out longer than I shoulda, and I came home to find my old man drunker than I'd ever seen him before. He told me I was a no-good so-and-so, and his fist started a-flying. I went to my room and pulled out my stash and ran out the door, and I ain't never been back since. I walked all the way to Fairbanks, found me a gold dealer, and then I went into the bank, and then I went to a real estate office. I bought my piece of property right there that day, without even looking at it. I've never even been to Circle, Alaska. I just knew it was mine, and it was far enough away from my dad that he'd never find me. And I've been in Circle ever since. With that, the old man went silent once again. Well, how'd you meet your wife? Jack inquired, to try to keep the old man a-going. I figured it'd keep him from focusing on his leg. Ah, sweet Jezebel. She was mean and ornery too, but I loved that woman. We had a saloon in town that refused to serve Injuns and women. Well, she walked right up to that bartender and dealt him a blow that knocked him right on his ass. Then she jumped over the bar, poured herself a glass of whiskey. When that bartender got up and reached for his gun, I was right there standing between them. I said, "Don't you touch a hair on her head. That's my wife," I yelled. Well, Jessie came home with me that night, and I proposed to her right proper. She never did tell me her real name, and said it was an Indian word that I wouldn't be able to pronounce anyways, so I just called her my sweet Jezebel. Jack looked over and smiled at him. "I'm sure sorry you lost her," he said. "Yeah, that was the worst day of my life," Grizzly replied, "and I ain't had a moment of happiness since." Jack let the silence surround them both. After a few minutes, he asked, "Well, you mentioned to me that you swore you wouldn't set foot back in Fairbanks again. Did something happen?" "Well, you are a nosy son of a dog, ain't you?" Grizzly grumbled, but he went on with his story anyway. "After I'd bought my property, I bought an old pickup truck to transport building material to the home site. Now, back in those days, Fairbanks was still a little rough. Well, I was cutting my own trees and building my cabin all by myself, but sometimes I needed things that you could only get in town. So I'd drive into Fairbanks and get my supplies, and I always paid cash. Well, this fella decides I must have a good mine claim to be paying for all these building supplies, so he decides to follow me home. Comes right up to my door and tells me he's a house builder and he'll help me get my cabin built if I hire him. I figured with winter coming on soon, I could probably use a little help, so I hired him. I let him put his bedroll down on the living room floor. Now that feller had spent no more than 2 weeks at my house when I woke up one night and he was on top of me, trying to shove a pillow into my face. I guess he figured he could smother me and steal my gold. Well, he should have tried to shoot me instead, because I easily overtook him and I smothered him instead. When I saw he wasn't breathing no more, I took his body and threw it into the river. I figured somewhere downriver he'd show up and there'd be questions asked, but a couple weeks went by and nothing happened. But then, that winter, I got a letter. Now, the mail only comes about once a month during the winter months, and that's if the mail plane can land safely. So I don't know how long that letter sat before I got it. It was from the Fairbanks Sheriff's Department, telling me I needed to appear for questioning. Seems since they couldn't call me and couldn't get their vehicles up the road to my place, they just sent a letter. Well, of course, I just ignored it, and so I haven't set foot in Fairbanks since. Oh, and how long ago was this? Jack says. Oh, hell, I don't know, maybe 30 years or so. Well, Jack laughed. Well, if no one's come after you in all that time, I hardly think there's anything to worry about. But just in case, we'll be sure to stay out of the way of the local sheriff. Yeah, good idea, Grizzly muttered. How do you do your banking and things like that if you never go into Fairbanks? Jack wondered out loud. How does a man survive out here in the wilderness with no phone and no real contact with the outside world other than a bartender and a few goods available at the general store in town? Well, once a month my bank sends some man up here to handle things for me, and he sort of runs a few errands for me as well. I pay him pretty good for the convenience. They drove up to the medical clinic entrance, and Jack helped Grizzly out of the truck. Now, Grizzly refused to sit in a wheelchair, but since he could not put any pressure on his injured leg, he had to lean heavily on Jack for support. Jack got him into a seat and explained to the entry clerk what the extent of his injuries were. And so what is your relationship to this man, Grizzly Adams? She snickered a little at the name. He's my father-in-law, Jack quickly responded, not knowing what else to say. He knew that if he didn't claim some manner of relationship, they'd quickly dismiss him, and he wouldn't be able to help old Grizzly. The old man wouldn't know how to navigate all the entry forms without Jack. And do you know what his real name is? She asked. No, he's always gone by that name. My wife told me his real name once, but I've forgotten. Lying didn't come easily to Jack, but he was sure this sounded suspicious to the entry clerk. But she went on ahead and handed Jack the forms Grizzly needed to fill out. After a short waiting period, they took Grizzly back into an exam room. While he was waiting, Jack phoned Sasha to let her know that they'd arrived. Sasha had been busy cleaning Grizzly's cabin and had picked a fresh bouquet of wildflowers, had them sitting in a mason jar on the table. She had taken the curtains down and shaken them outside. Years of accumulated dust billowed off the curtains. She was dusting all the jars of preserved fruits and vegetables from the shelf when Jack called. Well, we just got here, and I'm sorry you're stuck there, Jack said. I don't mind a bit, Sasha replied. This place hadn't been cleaned in at least a decade. It's going to take me all day just to get rid of the dirt. The doctor came out to find Jack, so he quickly ended his call, let Sasha know he'd fill her in as soon as he knew anything. Well, Grizzly says you stitched him up. Good job. The stitches are clean and tight. We won't have to do anything with that. But he is inflamed, and we've given him a dose of antibiotics and some painkillers. We'll send him home with a prescription for more. But there's something else that's worrying me, and we've run some blood work. We won't know for certain until the test results come back. But I've got a suspicion that your father-in-law, is it, has bone cancer. There's some clear indicators that we're seeing in the x-rays. We need to keep him here overnight. God, have you told him yet? Jack knew Grizzly wouldn't take the news well. No, we wanted to get the bone scan results in before we made an official diagnosis. Can you tell if someone has bone cancer just from looking at an x-ray? The doctor looked down at his feet and nodded his head. On an x-ray, bone cancers often appear as a ragged, less solid appearance. It looks as if the bones have holes formed within them. However, I must say that we require further tests to diagnose bone cancer with certainty. We'll be running blood samples and more bone scans, and I recommend a biopsy. We'll also be running an MRI and an angiogram just to make sure that his heart is stable. I understand, Jack said, although he knew Grizzly would not stay the night without a fight. He asked if he could see Grizzly now, and the doctor led him back to the room. Hey, old man, Jack said. The once gruff and grizzled man looked very much less intimidating in his hospital bed, hooked up to tubes and monitors. Why the hell haven't they let me out yet, he says. A doctor who was still standing next to Jack responded. Grizz, we need to keep you here overnight. We need to do some additional tests to see what's really going on with that leg of yours. The hell you will. Grizzly jumped up from the bed and attempted to make it to the door, but the pain and the weakness in his injured leg prevented him from getting very far. The doctor reached out to keep him from falling, but Grizzly's fist just grazed the doctor's jaw. Jack reached out to grab Grizz and nearly met his fist as well. The nurse held out a hypodermic needle and injected his arm with a fast-acting sedative while the doctor and Jack both held him. Let me out of here, Grizzly yelled. You can't keep me here. Within seconds, 2 or more orderlies were in the room, and they had Grizzly back on the bed, his arm in restraints. Grizzly, Jack said firmly, they need to do some tests on your bones. The x-rays don't look good. Just let them take the tests and then I'll drive you back home. I'm going to stay right here until they release you. Damn you for taking me here, Jack. I'm afraid they're never going to let me leave, Grizzly replied. Well, it's okay. Just a few tests and you'll be out of here in no time at all. I promise. Besides, they're as anxious to get you out of here as you are to get out, Jack said as he watched Grizzly's eyelids start to flutter and close. The sedative was already taking effect. Jack called Sasha and let her know he'd be spending the night at the hospital. She assured him that she'd be just fine. She had her sleeping bag and would camp out on Grizzly's sofa for the night. She had her book, and that would keep her company until Jack returned. Sasha poured herself and the dogs a bowl of leftover venison stew and made a small salad of wild greens that she had gathered. Sitting at the table, she opened her book, Wolf's Cross by S.A. Swan, and picked up where she left off. Anno Domini 1333. Her name was Luciana, but she didn't remember who had named her. She lived in the deepest woods east of Grad-Naru, mostly ignorant of the humans dwelling there. The people who lived on the fringes of these woods, especially those whose families had spent generations in its shadows, knew of her and her kind. Luciana's ancestors haunted the tales that had been spoken of in hushed tones ever since the land had become Christian. However, it had been a long, long time since Luciana had had a family, and a long time since her kind had haunted these woods in any numbers. She was alone, and the old folks' tales about wolves clothed in human skin had become less urgent, less of a deterrent for hungry men who needed to stock their families' larders. Luciana would watch these men as they made their pitiful attempts at hunting. Sometimes she would watch with the eyes of a wolf, and sometimes with the eyes of a raven-haired maiden. She would watch them come into her wood, and more often than not return empty-handed. She watched, not out of any malice, but out of curiosity and a deep loneliness. She was the last of her kind in these woods, and she thought perhaps the last of her kind anywhere. These men who came to find game, they all had a home to go to. Home was an alien, a concept to Luciana as having to trap her prey or shoot it with an arrow. Each winter, her despair grew deeper. She would always be alone, and she envied these human women who sent their men out to hunt for their dinner. What could these frail human women give that she could not? She was stronger than they were. She was faster. She was a better hunter than these poor men. It was not long before she decided there was no reason she couldn't have what they had. Once she resolved this, Luciana studied these men with a new eye, looking for someone she could love, who could love her back. She watched how they moved, how they hunted, how they carried their kill. And only days into the winter, when the snow barely dusted the needle floor of her woods, she saw the man who would become her mate. This man had broad shoulders and seemed to stand above all the others who braved her forest. This was the man who would free her from her solitude. Oh, this is getting good, Sasha thought as she made herself a cup of tea from some wild mint she had found growing outside of Grizzly's cabin. She poured the dogs a small bowl of milk for a treat and settled in to read more of her book. Now, back in Mexico, the fire had quickly engulfed the ranch house, but the sprinkler systems installed in the ceiling kicked in and kept the fire from spreading throughout the entire hacienda. And it didn't take long for the firemen to arrive and put out the remaining flames. Well, we're sure lucky we got here right after it started, Juanita told Rosa, who was standing in her smoke-filled kitchen crying. The kitchen had not been burnt, but it smelled of smoke and ash. The stucco walls and the Mexican tile floor and ceilings had sustained only a minor amount of damage. Now, this will take some cleaning up, but it could have been much, much worse, Julian explained as he finished inspecting the rest of the property. The barn is intact. The horses are a bit spooked, but they'll be fine. Juanita took Julian's arm and led him outside, away from Rosa. I know who did this. It was that jerk Montoya. I'm sure that's who we saw driving away from here like a maniac. Well, what should we do about it? Julian asked. I'll go after him right now if you say the word. No, this is a game of cat and mouse, and he's the rat. We'll have our revenge. But let me think of a cruel way to do it, Juanita replied. Julian just nodded his head. Okay, but we need to act quickly before he does something else. I'm thinking that was just a warning, just to get your attention. I think he has much more planned for us. We should call Miguel and kind of let him know what happened. Right, you do that. I'm going to go make some phone calls of my own. I am prepared to really destroy that man's life this time. Julian had no doubt Juanita was capable of doing just that, and worse. Finally, after much poking and prodding, Grizzly was released. To say he was in a foul mood would be putting it lightly. Jack offered to buy him a steak. What man doesn't feel better after a nice ribeye, Jack thought. But Grizzly said he wanted a whiskey, so they stopped at an Irish pub that served food on the edge of town, ordered a couple steaks and some good Irish whiskey, and they were silent over lunch. Grizzly seemed to be in deep thought, and Jack just didn't pry. He already knew what the doctor had told him. The prognosis was not good. Jack figured Grizzly needed some time to let that sink in. And it was early afternoon when they began their long drive home to Circle. Jack drove silently. He didn't want to pressure Grizzly into talking, but after a while the whiskey had loosened Grizzly's tongue. I reckon it's been a very long time since I let anyone into my private affairs. When my wife died, I didn't want to live, and I just shut myself up in the cabin. Nothing seemed important enough to say, and after being quiet for so long, it just became a habit, you know. But the doc says I'm dying. I suppose you already know that since you went and told them that you were my son-in-law. Grizzly snorted a slight laugh at that statement. Well, I had to tell them something so they'd let me in to see you, Jack replied. Grizzly lifted one bushy eyebrow at Jack. Truth is, I ain't got no relatives. Nobody. I told you about my ma's death, and as far as I know, my dad's gone too, and if he ain't, he ought to be. I never had no kids, no brothers and sisters or cousins, nothing, and nobody. So I figured you're as close as anyone to hearing my story. The doc says I have stage 4 bone marrow cancer. That's the inside of my bones look like Swiss cheese. He says it's my damn ornery nature that's kept me alive this long. He says I don't have long, and that this here injury might just be the thing that does me in. And I don't have anybody else to ask, Jack. So I'm asking you. I don't want to die in any damn hospital. I need to die in my own cabin, and I need someone to make damn sure that that happens. And if you agree to help me out on this, well, I'd like to make you a bargain. Grizzly continued on. I don't have anyone else to give it all to, and I sure as hell don't want the government taking all I got. So I'm offering you a deal, Jack. You stay on and make sure I die my own way in my own place. Look in on me every now and then, make sure my Molly gets fed, and if I'm not able, keep me drowning in whiskey 'cause the doc says the pain's fixing to get unbearable. Give me a little dignity to pass on with, and in return, I sign my parcel over to you." Jack gulped, not quite sure what to say. "Grizzly, I'd be willing to stay on and help you through this, but I've got family to consider, and well, your cabin is not quite conducive to honeymooning in. I'm not so sure I could convince Sasha to sleep on your floor for the next several months, especially with winter right around the corner." Grizzly chuckled. "Hell, I'm not saying y'all are going to sleep with me. I don't want to wake up and see your ugly wolf face looking at me every day. No, you and your bride will move into the big house." The big house? Jack didn't remember seeing any other structures on the property other than the cabin and the mule shed. "Look," Grizzly replied, "I got nearly 3,000 acres in all. That ridge line and miles up the Yukon River, that's all mine. Back when my sweet Jezzy was alive, we were building the house of our dreams right up on that ridge looking over all the valley and the river. The views up there are just amazing. Well, we built a nice log home up there. Well, at least we started it. It still needs a few things done, but it's right livable just as it is. I reckon it's big enough for you and all the rest of your family members as well. The land's got 3 gold mine claims, all of which produce a nice bundle of money and more water and mineral rights than you'd ever know what to do with." Now, Jack remembered the bartender in Circle telling him that Grizzly lived on a small parcel outside of town. He wondered if this was the whiskey talking this foolishness or if Grizzly was really telling the truth. "Gosh, Grizzly, I don't know what to say. The offer sounds too good to be true." "Well, like I said," the old man explained, "I ain't got no one else to give it to." "What were you planning on doing with your property before you met us and before this whole thing happened?" Jack waved his hand toward the injured leg. "You're getting on in years. Surely you would have had a plan for all your property and your holdings." "Never much one to think about it," Grizzly replied. "Maybe I was going to give it to some damn wolf sanctuary or something." Jack laughed. "Like I said, I don't know what to say. This offer sounds, well, honestly, just too good to be true. I'd love to just say yes, but there's a lot of legalities involved, and I need to know this isn't just the whiskey or the narcotics they gave you." Grizzly gave him another one of the bushy eyebrows. "You don't believe me, huh? Well, as soon as we get back to the cabin, you take your sweet missus and you head up that road to the ridge. You'll see the house up there. And if you stand right on that big log porch overlooking the valley, all the land that you can see on this side of the river, just almost as far as the eye can see, all belongs to my land trust. And then tomorrow, you drive back to Fairbanks and you ask the bank about the Walter O'Malley Land Trust, and then they'll show you the state of my holdings. All it's going to take is a signature from me, and I'll sign it all over to you on my death, with one requirement, that I die in my own bed and in my own cabin, and afterwards you burn it to the ground, with me in it. I want to hold my sweet Jezebel's ashes in my arms, and then you light that cabin up." Well, Jack had a lot to think about now that this offer had been made. He knew what Sasha would say. "This is your good karma coming back to reward you for all the good things you've done in your life, Jack." Well, maybe it was. You never know when someone you meet might just change your whole life. Even someone as gruff and ornery as old Grizzly Adams.